Hey guys, immunology summary. Let's talk about immune system organs. You have primary organs and secondary organs. Primary organs are bone marrow and thymus. Thymus is where T cells undergo their education, maturation, and they're called T cells because thymus starts with a T. T cells are actually born in the bone marrow, just like all other immune cells and all other blood cells. Bone marrow is where all blood cells are born. B cells are born in the bone marrow, but they stay home and undergo their maturation education in the bone marrow. That's why we call them B cells for bone marrow. Secondary immune system organs are lymph nodes, tonsils, spleen, and Peyer's patches. Peyer's patches are found in the small bowel part called ileum. Let me remind you what the small bowel is like. We have a stomach, then you have duodenum, then you have jejunum, and then you have ileum, then you have colon. So ileum comes after DJ, DJI, DJ whose name is I. So ileum is the last part of the small bowel. And in the subepithelial part of ileum, subepithelium meaning under the epithelium of ileum, you have lymphoid tissue. Notice it looks like lymph nodes, but is not. It's lymphoid tissue because Peyer's patches have no capsules. Okay, so they literally look like patches of lymphoid tissue, and their function is to make immunoglobulin A, which protects the epithelium, protects against infections. So lymphatic tissue in general is responsible for distribution, but also maturation and maintenance of lymphocytes. And secondary lymphatic tissue is where antigens are shown to the immune cells, the B and T cells, and immune cells thus get an education. All right, just like the cardiovascular system has blood vessels, lymphatic system has lymphatic vessels. And what lymphatic vessels do is they take fluid and protein, namely fluid that is in excess of what is normal, fluid that is between the cells in the tissues. We call it interstitial fluid. And those few random leak proteins that leak from blood vessels. So once again, interstitial fluid and leak blood proteins. Lymphatic vessels take both of those to the bloodstream, back to the bloodstream. Additionally, what lymphatic vessels do is they take digested fats to the bloodstream. They help transport and incorporate digested fats into the bloodstream. Those lymphatic vessels that are involved in absorption of fats and transport of these fats from the digestive tracts to the blood are called lacteals. They derive their name from the word lacteus, which means milk. You know, lactose, you see those words in the supermarket in association with milk. Lacteals look so because they look milky. When do you see those? In patients who have had, for example, the unfortunate accidents, motor vehicle accidents, where their intestines are ripped open, you can actually see that milky liquid dripping out of lacteals that have been damaged. You don't normally see lymphatic vessels. But in cases of inflammation of lymphatic vessels, you can actually see them, for example, as red streaks visible in skin if the skin is pale. This inflammation of the lymphatic vessels is called lymphangitis. Itis is an inflammation. Lymph, you know what you're talking about. Lymphatic vessels. So angion stands for vessel. So lymphatic vessels, vessel inflammation is called lymphangitis. Remember the word lymphangitis. Now, what would happen if I were to block off a lymphatic vessel? for a long time. Chronos is a Greek word for, sorry, my sleeve is pressing something. All right, so chronos is a Greek word for time. Chronic means for a long time. So if you block lymphatic vessels for a long time, you're going to see a very, very severe swelling of the part of the body that lymphatic vessel is coming from. If you block a lymphatic vessel of the arms, arms will be severely swollen. If you block it in the legs, legs will be severely swollen. Sometimes there is an infection with a worm in parts of the world like Africa, Southeastern Asia, where patients don't seek medication right away. And what you see is a generalized swelling of body parts, and we call it elephantiasis. Look up the pictures. It's a very sad sight. Should not be happening. Early treatment would prevent that. So lymphatic vessels, just like blood vessels, just like veins, join together and form larger lymphatic vessels. We call them trunks. For example, a trunk that drains head and neck is called jugular trunk. A trunk that drains lower extremities is called lumbar trunk. So eventually all of these larger vessels, larger trunks, join together on the right and form the thoracic duct, and on the left and form the thoracic duct on the left. So there is a right thoracic duct and there is a left thoracic duct. These thoracic ducts empty into the subclavian vein, empty their material into the vein underneath the clavicle that's called subclavian, in the area right next to the neck where the vein called internal jugular vein empties into that subclavian vein. All right, so what you do need to know is that the body, most of the body empties into the left subclavian vein. Most of the lymphatic vessels of the body empty into the left subclavian vein, and it's very easy to remember. Here is a humanoid that I'm drawing, left side, right side, except for the lymphatic vessels that drain this part of the body, the right part of the body above the diaphragm. You know the diaphragm on the right. We said diaphragm is very important because the heart receives superior vena cava that drains all the blood from above the diaphragm, and inferior vena cava that drains blood from below the diaphragm, right? Similarly, on the right, all of the lymphatic vessels above the diaphragm drain into the thoracic duct on the right thoracic duct. Whereas everything else, the whole body apart from that, drains into the left thoracic duct. So thoracic duct is the main collecting duct system of the main collecting duct of the lymphatic system. Please know it, thoracic duct. You have one on the left, you have one on the right, but the one on the right only receives lymphatic vessels from above the diaphragm on the right, and the one on the left drains the whole body. That means the whole left part of the body, but also the right part of the body underneath the diaphragm. All right, let's talk about lymph nodes. Lymph nodes have various shapes. Sometimes they look a little bit oval, but otherwise they look like kidneys, like beans, like cashew-shaped structures, basically something like this. And these are stations found along the length of the lymphatic vessels. Okay, so what they have is they all contain specialized lymphocytes, the B and T cells that are capable of destroying pathogens in a very, very specific way, and we'll talk about the B and T cells in the next slide. These lymph nodes have a three-dimensional structure thanks to trabeculae. And you've seen this word trabeculae as a part of trabeculae carne for the muscles of the heart. Trabeculae carne. No, these are different trabeculae. These are beam-like structures of the lymph nodes, and these are responsible for creating compartments in the lymph nodes, okay? So lymph nodes receive lymphatic vessels, and they also have lymphatic vessels that leave lymph nodes, and those that arrive, the lymphatic vessels arriving to the lymph nodes are called afferent lymphatic vessels, and those that leave, as in leave, exit, are called efferent lymphatics. Okay, so lymphatic fluid enters the lymph nodes via the afferent lymphatics and exits via the efferent lymphatics at the hilum, and this is the hilum. Hilum is that little cave, a slight depression on one side. So these efferent vessels form lymphatic trunks. It's these smaller efferents that finally find each other and form larger trunks. These trunks, so the three important regions of lymph node aggregations are in the groin, that's the inguinal part, under the armpits, that's the axillary part, and the neck, that's the cervical part. And it's just areas where there are collections, aggregations of lymph nodes. So, because there are more lymph nodes in that area, if there is an infection, you're going to see a swelling in that area more likely than anywhere else. You're obviously going to see a swelling in the lymph nodes that is close to that infection. This is why we'll look at the lymph nodes in the axillary region for patients who are getting a breast exam, because all of the lymphatics that drain breast pass through the axillary region. Okay, so axillary region is where you want to look for enlarged lymph nodes to ensure breast is healthy. Now, you do need to know that lymph nodes that are enlarged due to an infection are very painful. All of you have probably felt those painful lymph nodes at some point in your life. This is different in cases of cancer. There is a cancer called, for example, Hodgkin lymphoma. It's a B-cell cancer, B-cell related cancer, okay? And in Hodgkin lymphoma, you have lymph node enlargement. Only those enlargements are not painful. So if someone has painful lymph nodes, it's good. If they have any questions about do they have cancer or not, it's more likely than not that not painful means cancer and painful means no cancer. So just remember, infections and inflammations are painful, and therefore lymph nodes are painful as well. Just like we have lymphangitis, which was the inflammation of the lymphatic vessels, we also have lymphadenitis, which is the word for inflammation of lymph nodes or glands, lymph nodes or. All right, now let's talk about the cells of the immune system. B and T lymphocytes are cells of immune system, and it's these cells that decide whether a transplantation is successful or whether an organ or whether an organ is rejected. B and T lymphocytes can be easily recognized on slides. I showed you some pictures. They don't have granules. B lymphocytes are responsible for our humoral immunity. I'll go over T lymphocytes on the next slide. Humoral immunity is involved with production of antibodies. Humoral immunity means that antibodies are produced, and antibodies are produced by cells called plasma cells. B cells form these plasma cells that are specialized cells that make antibodies when B cells become plasma cells. Please do know that any type of foreign bodies that enter our bodies called an antigen, and um, any and usually foreign substance that activates our immune system and promotes formation of antibodies is called an antigen. Okay, so hopefully, and I went over this in class. I explained how you have to think about antigen versus antibody. Antigen is an antibody generator. Antigen is an antibody generator, and antibody is a mold of that antigen at a molecular level. A three-dimensional antigen gives you a three-dimensional mold that's called an antibody. All right, now let's talk about antibodies. I've already talked about the IgA, which is produced in the Peyer's patches in the ileum, and IgA is responsible for keeping our intestines healthy. We also have IgG, IgE, IgD. There is also IgM. Let's not talk about it. We can't talk about everything during these short lectures. But do know that IgG is a very, very important immunoglobulin. It's the greatest one of all. Why? It can cross placenta and protect the little kid. It's the only one that can cross placenta and go from mom's blood into blood of that little kid and provide protection to the baby while mom is carrying that baby in utero. All right. What does it do? It can act against viruses. It can act against bacteria. It can act against any toxins as well. All right. Now, you also need to know IgE. It's very easy to remember that IgE is associated with allergic reaction. And what it does, it takes part in allergies. Just remember how allergy is spelled like allergy, okay, for IgE. Allergy for IgE, and it's involved with any antigens that cause allergy, okay? So IgD, its function is really not very well known. It just sits there on the surface of the B lymphocytes, and we think that it's involved in B cell activation. T lymphocytes are a part of the cell-mediated immunity, and we like to think that they're primarily responsible to fight cancer, fungi, and viruses. Do know that the disease called AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, is actually caused because the number of T lymphocytes in blood decreases. This is because the virus, human immune deficiency virus, actually destroys and kills the T lymphocytes. As I mentioned earlier, T cells undergo education maturation in the thymus. They become what is called immunocompetent. It means that they can now make decisions which we can trust. And this happens after they undergo their education in the thymus, which is a massive tissue that has two lobes. It's bilobed in the mediastinum. That's where the heart is. That's where the trachea is. So thymus is along the trachea, but it actually shrinks in size and disappears by the age of 3. You can't see it anymore. Enlarged thymus indicates that you need to be examined by an endocrinologist. So T cells uh, do recognize antigens, and they require special help of cells called antigen presenting cells, APCs, antigen presenting cells. That may be macrophages, that may be monocytes, that may be B cells, and other cells. What these antigen presenting cells do is that they engulf, that means they phagocytose an object, for example, a bacterium. They digest that larger object into little pieces that have a three-dimensional structure that can be recognized, an individual three-dimensional structure, and these little pieces are called antigens. So antigen-presenting cells phagocytose larger objects, break them down into antigens, and present those antigens on the surface of there. So this is the cell, this is the nucleus. So antigen presenting cells present those antigens on the surface of their plasma membrane. And these, among others, these antigens are presented to T cells, and then T cells can actually recognize these antigens. This way they're taught which antigens are good, which antigens are bad, and now they know when to kill a cell and when not to kill a cell. All right, now when you're exposed to viruses, viruses are very small agents that have DNA or RNA and can infect other cells, or bacterial infections. What happens is that as a part of recovery to fight those infections, you develop antibodies against antigens that are a part of the viruses or bacteria. So because viruses and bacteria are a part of nature, we didn't make those viruses, we didn't make those bacteria. We call those infections natural infections. We also call immunity that we acquire due to those infections naturally acquired immunity, natural acquired active immunity. Now, how do you remember it? Who made varicella? Who made herpes? Did you make varicella? Did you make herpes? No, they're found out there in nature. So it's a naturally acquired disease and a naturally acquired active immunity. Now, can you get an artificial immunity? You sure can. Artificial immunity is what you get when you get a vaccine shot. So each vaccine shot gives you an artificial immunity. This is a generalization. There is one exception, but never mind. Okay, so vaccine gives you artificially acquired active immunity. So why active? To know why active, you have to think about making antibodies and realize that antibodies is something that you make. You actively make and make those antibodies. And because you actively had to make those antibodies, we call those immunities where you need to make your antibodies yourself active immunity. So both naturally acquired immunity due to a disease such as varicella, due to viruses such as varicella and herpes, are naturally acquired active immunities. But also when you get a vaccine shot, don't forget that what you have is an artificially acquired active immunity. Don't forget that vaccines give you an active immunity. When antibodies are no longer needed, at some point we don't want to waste our energy resources in the body making any antibodies. What happens to B cells is that they no longer make plasma cells. Instead, they become memory B cells. And those memory B cells can easily become plasma cells again if there is a re-exposure, if the antigens that are already known to the body are seen again. That memory B cell will wake up from its sleep and very quickly restart the antibody production. All right, so to enable cells talking to each other, to provide us with this immunity, we need cellular hormones called cytokines. There are many of them, but you do need to know two. One is called interleukin 1. Inter means between. Leukin, here you go, WBC again, white blood cells. So it's the hormone where white blood cells are talking among each other. So you know lymphocytes are white blood cells, right? So scientists noticed that elevation of interleukin 1 gives patients fever. It's a very important factoid that's randomly tested on NCLEX. The other interleukin analog, also a cytokine, is called interferon gamma, a hormone that cells use to talk to each other. So interferon gamma has two activities that you want to know. It talks to macrophages, increasing macrophage activity, and it also talks to two kinds of lymphocytes. The T cells that are cytotoxic, CD8 positive T cells, and the natural killer cells. Natural killer cells are those lymphocytes that had punctations, the granules I showed you in class. So what interferon gamma does, gamma macrophages, is that it increases activity of macrophage, increases ability of macrophages to do what they normally do. They increase phagocytosis and increase granuloma formation. Granuloma is like a building of a wall around an object that macrophages say, hey, you know what, I can't phagocytose and destroy that particular object. So they form a wall around that toxic area or infected area. Natural killer cells and cytotoxic T cells increase their ability with a name like that, cytotoxic, natural killer. What they do is they usually kill cells that they think are potentially going to harm us, and so they just do so in greater numbers, for example, virus-infected cells. Do know the term lysozyme. It's an enzyme that kills bacteria, for example, antimicrobial enzyme that is found in human secretions, your saliva, your tears, and it's a part of the innate immune system. We've been talking about humoral immune system. We talked about B cells, T cells. They're all a part of the humoral immune system. Lysozyme is a part of the innate immune system.